good evening. I hope you had a good day so far with us. I hope you have learned a lot, useful stuff. We want to close the day with this session with a more broader view on PDF and prepress. So you can think of it as being kind of a keynote style. So you could have this presentation also in the very beginning of such an event, where we just briefly look back into where we are coming from, meaning we as Color Software, I as a person working in prepress now for 30 years, being at Color Software for 12 years, David working for various companies at the very in that period of time, so starting at Enfocus, then Gradual, then Enfocus again, then 4Ps, then being, what is your role at GWG?
Right now I'm Executive Director.
Executive Director, so several roles, and we have seen the world changing in prepress and PDF world, and we just want to provide our view on that in this session. So, and that is the agenda. So first, really just briefly look back into where we are coming from as a person or as a representative of the organizations we are working for. Then an analysis of how we see the prepress world as shaped by PDF today, and then how we foresee the future to change or to evolve. So that's the I'm too quick with the time. So just one slide, because just in order to understand the future or foresee the future, it's always good to see where we are coming from. So actually, when I started my professional career, it was here in Berlin as a reproduction house, where they just made the transition from film to digital computers doing image calculations, and then I was in charge of the department with those new things that is called Macintosh, where Apple claimed that they could do everything much cheaper than what they used at that time in this company. And then we received Quark Express files, or what we called open files at that time, with images and fonts, everything separate, combined into a folder structure. And then, of course, you have problems all the time. You have license issues because the fonts are usually the license of the font doesn't allow you to give that to the receiver. So many problems. And then when PDF came to be available, it was really a big step forward, because then we had all of a sudden a single file that could be easily viewed, and that was actually pretty much at the very moment as it was possible to have everything that you need in a PDF file for printing. Pretty much from that very moment, it was the only format being used. However, it also quickly turned out that not every PDF file prints well. So when you have a PDF file and the one is good and the other is bad, and then the industry was looking for a tool that would allow them to just identify PDF files that are having problems and separate them from PDF files that don't. And that was when pre-flighting tools were invented that were able to do exactly that. And then we are already at around 2005 or so, when I think pre-flight was pretty much around everywhere, so every prepress house at least knew what pre-flight is, and we will have some statistics on how much it is actually used today later on. But at that point of time also, Adobe asked us, we were at that time already providing our pre-flight solution to Adobe. Adobe was also telling us, okay, but customers are saying, okay, it's good to know whether a PDF file prints nicely, but it would be even better to make it just work, so to be able to correct it. And then that was a time when correction, so making PDF files that couldn't be printed, printable, so when correction were introduced. And I think in these days, so since then, it moves even further. So pre-flight and correction basically isn't a difficult thing to do. So this is state of the art. Nowadays, it's more about automation things. So it's not that much about being able to check files or to correct files. It's more about being able to do that in a non-interactive, automated way. And that is because the whole industry is shaped by, I don't know, a decrease in prices and also a decrease in print runs, and then the only way to get that to work is to process PDF files in an automated way. Is that clear so far? So this was, I guess.
Yeah. So what do you need for automation? And it becomes painfully clear when we get involved in projects at actual companies. What you need is, I need to move around, right? What you need is some kind of standardization. If you don't have a target to shoot at with automation, if you're not sure that the inputs are always going to be the same, it's very hard to automate things afterwards. So at some point, when you want to talk about automation, the topic has to go back to standardization. That is something that we have a lot of in graphic arts. Now, I found this nice cartoon online that talks about standardization and how standards are made. And where, and this is very often true, you start out with a situation where there are 14 competing standards, and then someone has the bright idea that maybe we can find a way of developing something that is universal, so that everyone can work with the same thing, and there is one standard to rule them all. And what happens in that case? You end up in a situation where there are 15 competing standards, because now you've created an extra one, and of course, people find a reason that it's not usable, so it's just another one that gets added to the list. Now, I don't want to let this one go without giving credits. This is a physicist, actually, who writes cartoons about all kinds of stuff online. But it's really true, and if you work in standardization in graphic arts, unfortunately, it's something that you see happening as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we currently record this?
Yes, we do. So, why is there such a proliferation of standards? Why do we end up, I think at some point there was a slide about all these ISO PDF-based standards. Why do we have so many? And why, if you look at PDFX, do you end up with 15 different PDFX standards? I say 15, it's probably closer to 12 or something, but still, it's a lot. And you have PDFX 1A, 3, 4, 5N, 5PG. 5G, it's insane. Why do we do that? Well, of course, because you make a standard, and when you make a standard, you try to keep it simple. And you try to solve one particular use case, and as soon as you made the standard and it becomes a little bit used by people, someone goes like, oh, but what I want to do isn't covered, and then you have to make a new standard to cover that use case. And it goes on and on from there. A little bit of an exception, in a way, was the Ghent Workgroup standards. That started out as a separate effort, and then luckily we had the idea, but also the two ways of working were different enough, but we had the idea that maybe we shouldn't create something that is completely new. And again, workgroup standards were built on top of the PDFX standard. So in this case, it was an addition rather than something completely new. The good thing about the standards development process at ISO, I think, at the moment is, and I think you already pointed to that this morning, is that there is a convergence going on. If you look at what happens in PDFX and you look at what happens in PDFA, for example, those have always been relatively similar, but not exactly. There were very annoying differences. And you see that where possible, people try to write these standards in such a way that they have things shared between them and that the wheel is not reinvented the whole time.
Yeah, actually, just to build on that, I'm in these ISO meetings and people are easily confused when they say, okay, this is PDFA, and then there's PDFX, PDFVT, VCR, and then people say, okay, but why are you making this stuff so confusing? And then the answer is, I mean, you have different requirements, and it would be easy for ISO to just write one standard that covers it all, but then it would be also more difficult to create a PDF file that complies with all of these standards. So for this very reason, there are so many of them. But what we do at ISO is, and luckily the people in the committees are the same, that wherever possible, the very same words are used for the standards, wherever that makes sense. So, going back to callas, how has callas evolved? So actually callas was founded in 1995 by Olaf Drömer here in Berlin, and pretty much from the beginning it was about automation. At that time, again, Quark Express was around, so there was a solution like Airbag XT, which we had this morning, which, by the way, was a tool that allowed you to find, you know that?
No.
Okay. In Quark Express, you have a box, and then you type text into the box. And when, for instance, you transfer the Express file to a different computer, and then there is a slightly different font there, which means the text may go a little longer, just little, but long enough that it wouldn't fit into the box anymore. And then you have a small icon at the lower right side of the box indicating that there is a text overflow. However, if you are in an automated environment, you wouldn't read all text whether there are any of these tiny small indicators that there is text overflow. The Airbag XT would give you a warning or would stop your workflow if there is such text overflow. So that was a tiny tool. It only made sense in an automated environment, and that was coming together with Autopilot XT, yet another automation tool that allowed you to automate Quark Express. Yeah, so from the beginning it was about automation. Then there was PDF Batch Meister, which was a batch tool for Acrobat at that time. Then there was a pre-flight tool, PDF Inspector, and then we thought, okay, we at Callas Software, we made the decision to work on PDF, to concentrate on the internals of PDF and to not go into workflow. And then we wanted to make it easy to integrate our PDF technology into workflows, and that's why we came up with a command line module. So what my claim here is that actually from the very beginning, whatever we did at Callas Software, we thought about automation.
Yeah, and it's different than what happened at Enfocus, and I can say so because I was there. But it's an interesting thing to know if you think about the Callas products and you want to figure out where they are positioned versus the Enfocus products, for example. The way of thinking, especially at the beginning, was very, very different. When Enfocus started to make Pitstop, it was an editing tool. It didn't have pre-flight yet. It was Enfocus Checkout. It was a separate plugin. It just did object editing. That's what it did. And from there, we started having questions from usually larger OEMs the big guys that wanted to do something with this technology in an integrated way in their products. And we started making an SDK for them, but it was an SDK, not a CLI, and I think that's important. So the focus was on the one hand on editing, and on the other hand on integration in these large systems where people wanted to have their own library version that they could integrate because that was cool, and developers don't like to work with CLIs and for integration and stuff. I still see that today. So it's a different focus on starting the product line than what you had at Callas, and that's still the big difference you see today. If you look at Bitstop Pro and you look at pdfToolbox desktop, then object editing is only available in Bitstop Pro. That's where it's very strong at. If you look at the automation capabilities, then the way that is done on the Enfocus side and on the Callas side, I think is still different. Beyond Enfocus, well, the next thing I did anyway was this company called Gradual Software, and what we did there was switch. And where Enfocus didn't focus on the, it's a very annoying company name for that, didn't focus on the automation parts, that's what we really wanted to do with Switch. At least that's what we told people we wanted to do. The reason the company was founded was different. The reason the company was founded was metadata. It was always about providing a way to work with metadata and have an interface to allow people to enter metadata and fill metadata both manually and automatically. Except that we happened to buy a small company called Caslon or Caslon Soft rather, and they had this really cool product, Caslon Flow, and we made a Switch version because we thought this is going to help us with this. And then all of a sudden we started making, well, I shouldn't say a whole lot of money, but we started making a lot of money with Switch, so the focus kind of changed to automation. But these two things are very intimately connected. If you think about automation, what I said, you have to think about standardization. What you also have to think about is metadata. That's really what tells you what you can do with files as they go through a workflow.
Yeah, metadata definitely is something that is, when I have done several presentations on metadata, and I have to admit most of them are boring. So metadata is really a boring topic for most people. But in the end, it's still the stuff that allows you to automate things. So data about data is the stuff that you need in order to automatically process PDF files. And we will get to metadata later in this presentation as well. But this is related to metadata as well. I think what we think as colors, one of the important building blocks for today's prepress world are variables, and that was invented by Callas Software in 2006. And when you just think about, we have heard PDFX, the ISO standard for the prepress industry, similar for PDFA, such a profile in Enfocus product or in Callas product has 170 checks and 25 corrections, so quite a lot. And then you have maybe several products, and each product adds some additional check, like I have a check for image resolution, which is not part of PDFX or the page size or whatever. And then if you have for each of your products a dedicated profile, and then you would want to change just one check in any of the profiles, then you would have to open each of the profiles to modify whatever the resolution or so, because you just have a new printing machine and this takes other resolutions or digital press or whatever. So the whole thing wouldn't work anymore. So in order to do automation, it is crucial to be able to just during runtime adjust a profile for a particular product. And that is where you would use variables inside of a profile so that when calling a profile you say, okay, in this particular case my target resolution is 300 ppi, and then the very next time when you call the same profile you say, but now it's 250. And that, again, is where metadata comes into play, because only if you have that metadata, then you know, or your engine knows, what value actually to be used for this variable. And that's pretty much where we are today in the prefiled world. Yeah.
So, one of the interesting things, and you said about 30 years in graphic arts?
Yeah.
I'm not there yet. I think I started in 1996. So I'm 22.
Almost 30 years.
Yeah. So, but I'm getting there slowly. One of the interesting things is that in the course of the years, you have various surveys that have been done. Some of them by Enfocus, this last one that you see on here by the Tec-IT. And it's interesting to look at the questions by themselves, and the answers by themselves are interesting, but it's interesting to look at the same question that was asked in 1998, in 2008, and now in 2017, we did this one, I think, and to see the evolution in there. And this was a recurring question. The question is very simple. Do you pre-flight? Do you do quality control on the files in your workflow? And what you see is that in the oldest version of the surveys, the number of people that say that they pre-flight is significantly lower than what you see here. So this is a really good evolution. It means that people are more conscious today of the fact that it is important to check the files that come into their workflow. There is still 17% that doesn't. That either means they're not very clever or they have a workflow where it's not necessary, and both are possible. If I have a closed workflow that generates PDF files from a template, for example, and then I process them through the rest of the workflow, there is no need to pre-flight because I know where they come from, I know how they were generated, so why would I do that? But a very large proportion of people say that they pre-flight, right? So hooray. Except, also interestingly, there's always an exception to being able to say hooray. And the next question is, how do you pre-flight? And the question lists several possibilities, and I don't know whether it's all readable, probably it is. And you can see the top item there. It has decreased over time, but unfortunately it is still there, and we are still at what's probably, I guess, is about 20%, well, less than 20, so 12 or something, I don't know the exact number. But a bunch of people still say that the way they pre-flight is by opening the PDF file in Apple Preview or some other free PDF viewer. I am sure the number is actually higher because this was asked by the Tec-IT group, and the Tec-IT group mostly reaches professional people in print and publishing. Go to creatives and ask them how they check that a PDF file is correct, and I think the answer in many cases will be, oh, I look at it on my iPad, for example. If you look at it on your iPad, you're looking on it, I guarantee it, in a viewer that does not do any type of color management. It probably doesn't show overprint preview. It might not show complex transparencies, and there's probably a bunch of other modern stuff it is not very good at. So that's not doing pre-flight. And the second line is not much better. I mean, they open it in Acrobat or in Reader, which, if it's not on an iPad, because that one is not good either, but if it's on a computer, at least it will give you a better view on the PDF. It might or might not do overprint preview, depending on the settings. So it's a little bit better, but it's not much better because you still just look at this thing visually and then you decide whether it's good or not. So while we pre-flight, how we pre-flight is also important. And that is something that, well, a lot of people still haven't understood exactly. The other question that I wanted to highlight from, we have many more questions in this survey, but the other question is how many files contain errors? And this is something also where you see evolution. The evolution that we have over the last 20 years is that the percentage of files that have problems actually decreases, which is a good thing. It means that the PDF files that are created get better. Unfortunately, it doesn't differ all that much. It goes down a little bit, but not that much. So we're not making that many advances in teaching people how to create correct PDF documents, unfortunately. And then the last one, and that's the one to get depressed about the most probably, is that, at least from a printers and publishers point of view, is if you ask them what kind of errors they see in files, this list has not changed all that much. The only thing that changed mostly is the order of things and the fact that some new errors arrive because we've introduced new technology like transparency at some point. And then, well, if you go back to 98 and you ask about problems with transparency, you're not going to get much because that wasn't invented in PDF at that point, so you couldn't do it wrong, right? So those items appear, but the other items are largely the same, and the order is largely the same all the time as well.
That is one thing, a new feature in pdfToolbox 10, and while developing it, Enfocus came up with a solution that addressed the very same thing. So this seems to be something that is just around, so a new step in pre-flight PDF files. And what this example shows here is I have black text and, okay, black text, as you may know, should be set to overprint so that when you have minor variations in printing, so you would first print the orange, then print the black should not just cut out the background, it should be overprinting. However, in these two examples, only one of them really is a problem, because only black not set to overprint only is a problem if there is something behind. So far, neither of the pre-flight tools around was able to calculate such overlaps, because if you imagine a PDF page can easily have thousands of objects. If you would have to calculate for each object all contexts to all other objects on the same page, it's a huge amount of algorithms and processing that you would have to do. However, computers getting more fast and algorithms are around that are freely available in libraries. So this is something that is doable today. It was not in the beginning of pre-flight, but it's doable today, and it's in pdfToolbox 10, and a similar feature is in Enfocus. In this case, the problem was not to find out whether black text is set to overprint. That was easy, and that was there for a long time. The problem here was to make it as performant as possible. So it still would take time to process that, but that is just still a matter of seconds and not minutes. I have to speed up a little bit. And the other thing is intelligent variables. So we added, and same thing here, it's just something that is around, not just in our products. It's possible to do calculations inside of the product with variables. So far, you just enter a value. Now it's possible to do calculations. For instance, your MIS system, your production control system just gives you a brochure for the product name, and then the engine, the pdfToolbox profile, derives the required number of pages, which in this example would be 8. And what we have decided as Callas software is to use JavaScript for that. Future?
Yeah, so that's one trend. The trend that you see is that pre-flight becomes more intelligent, and actually in many cases it's not because the developers are all of a sudden much brighter than they were before, but because the equipment is there to actually run these things. You also see that with ink coverage checks, for example, that those went through a similar evolution. But there is another evolution that, that we think is important, and that in the callas products you see reflected quite a bit. And that is the fact that we're moving from a situation where the most important thing is to pre-flight a PDF file and correct it so that it can be used, to a situation where, yes, pre-flight you have to do, and correcting the files you have to do in many contexts. But there is much more you want to do. You want to take those PDF documents and you really want to make them ready for production. And that can mean all kinds of things, depending on the workflow. But what you see, for example, is that imposition steps are used, and not always for imposition, but for things like creating a proof version of a document that has a preview of the document and then some metadata associated with the document, and that a customer can sign off on. It's something that is not a print file, but it's very closely related to the print file. And having an engine that can also generate that is a very good thing. It means things like creating bleed, which goes much further than doing a simple correction. It's actually adding content to the document. It goes to things like, oh, I want a document that can move with the through my production workflow as a physical document, but I want a barcode on it so that every operator that touches that particular job scans the barcode, and I know in my MIS system where the job is. So I want to generate a document, again, probably with a preview, because, well, it's nice if an operator can see what the actual file is that he should be working on, and then you also want a barcode on it. Or you want to do something that goes beyond simple pre-flight, and you also want to figure out what ink consumption is, and maybe print that on that file that goes through the workflow, or send that back to a sales system, because that determines the sales price. So you move from a situation where you need an engine that is used for quality control to a situation where you also want to do all kinds of other stuff with that engine.
Yeah. And then David just mentioned engine, so this is something that we realize that kind of software, the requirements that we see, of course, still it's, I don't know, do something here for pre-flighting, provide us with some more correction capabilities, and we heard a little bit of that in the morning, but in general, the broader requirements are enhance the whole thing to do really new stuff that was not part of the initial pre-flight and correction approach. And that is what we call engines. So we haven't decided in, let's say, 2008 or 2009, oh, now it's the time to build in engines into our product. However, looking back, I would say at that point of time, we started doing so. So we introduced Imposition engine into the whole thing in order to do Imposition. The rendering engine that comes from Adobe, then came the Barcode engine from Tec-IT. So pdfToolbox by now is a product that makes PDF files ready, and the core of it still is pre-flight and correction, but it's more than it's adding objects, and we're using the WebKit HTML engine for that. The Google V8 is being used for the intelligent variables via JavaScript. So there are several engines inside of pdfToolbox. And
it's a very fundamental thing in pdfToolbox as I see it. If I talk to customers, one of the questions that they ask is what is the difference between pdfToolbox and Pitstop, for example, or the difference between what you can do in pdfToolbox and what you can do in the solutions from OneVision or others. There aren't that many anymore, so I probably named the two questions I get the most. And what you have to say is that on the one hand, of course, you can talk about pre-flight and what is different there, but let's face it, every application on the market today plays against the same standards. They all implement PDFX and the other ISO standards, and they implement what the Get Work Group does. And if you implement that, you kind of have the whole market when it comes to pre-flight. Where it differs is these things that you can do additionally in some of the products, and that's where I see the biggest difference between the two products at the moment. All the engines that you mentioned already, but let me just add another one to there, and that's the possibility to add content into a production file. So maybe not derive other documents from a production file, but look at a production file and say, okay, this one is good, but it is missing something. Very common thing, you are a label printer and people send you things, but what they don't do is they add varnish. And you know, because you know your production process, that if the file contains more than X amount of color, it needs a varnish layer. How do you do that? Well, in most cases, people today will do that manually. They don't have any other option. If you have an engine that can do things like add undercolor white, add varnishes in the right spots, only where there is other ink, for example, or add cut contours in files, then that gives you a significant advantage.
Yeah. And that's actually when I was visiting a customer, they are producing sweets for end users, like gifts, small, like this one, but transparent foil, and then printed something on it. What they needed to do is create a white form just where there needs to be some print on a page. And what they did is manually open the PDF file in Illustrator and then create a shapeware, sometimes manually, and then make it slightly bigger in order to create that white form. And then we thought, okay, that should be easier. And then is making PDF files ready, and we introduced a shapes engine into pdfToolbox. And what happens here is it renders the page. So in the first step, we would use the Adobe rendering engine, and then you could even say, just render me the black colorant or the whatever colorant, or only the text. And I have an example here on the right-hand side of this very slide here. So then it's rendered, then it's being traced, and that is another engine that we use in order to create to convert the rendered pixels into shapes, into vectors. It's a tracing engine. We have integrated PO trace for that, and that vectorization allows you to make it slightly bigger or smaller. So that wouldn't be possible with just the rendered results. So the vectors allow you to adjust the size, and then you can create a new object, as here being done, slightly bigger, and this could be a varnish or a white form, and I have just given it the color green here because that is better viewable than the color white, on a white slide at least. Yeah, yet another thing that was, looking back, again, this was nothing that we foresee in the future, in the beginning. It turned out that not just the PDF technology had to become more powerful over time, also other vendors needed to support PDF in the prepress world, and that is because why the OEM business for color software is so important, just because basically no vendor in the prepress area can live without supporting or being able to understand or modify PDF files. Yeah, next so I think this is are the engines that we wanted to cover. Now we want to talk about new standards.
Yeah, so one last point, and we're almost done with this as well. Again, to do automation and to do all these other things that we want to do in a pre-flight engine, for example, you need standardization. And sometimes the standardization runs a little bit behind on the facts, and this is a good example, I think, but it was corrected. One of the problems is if you want to deal with files in a packaging workflow or a large format workflow or label workflow, people put non-printing information in there. Like a die line, which is meant to indicate where the thing needs to be cut. It doesn't have to do anything with printing. It's the cutting step that needs that. And the way that was done in PDF is, and is still done in many cases, is you put elements in there in the PDF document, and you make them a spot color and you give them a name. The cutting line could be cut contour, but if I'm in Germany, it wouldn't be cut contour. It would probably be Stanze, if I'm correct.
Right.
Yeah. And same if something else in Dutch and something else in French and whatever. So it's very hard to automate that. You can't tell an automation process that if the customer who supplied this is French, look for this, and otherwise look for something else. That's very difficult. So what the standard does, meanwhile it's an ISO standard, what the standard does is it adds metadata to objects in the PDF file by using layers, technically, and it standardizes the metadata. So you can put standardized metadata in there that says this is the cut line. No matter how the spot color elements are used inside, this is the cut line. And that's the kind of stuff that you need to then build further automated workflows.
Yeah, this is another standard that has not been published yet, but I mentioned this morning, the print product metadata standard, and that, similar to processing steps, it uses metadata and allows you to embed metadata into a PDF file, again, in order to enhance your abilities to automatically process the same. But here, where processing steps uses layers, here pages are used, and then you can attach standardized metadata to pages, and that allows you to route pages differently. So, for instance, you could say, you could indicate whether a certain page needs to be printed in color or black and white. And then you can send the very same file to a color printer and a black and white printer, and the devices would recognize which pages they actually need to process. Or you use the same for digital printing machines where you're charged for color pages differently than for black and white pages. So this is around as well. So, or paper tray selection where you print on pre-printed paper, binding options. So you have standardized metadata that allow you to control the workflow for the PDF files. Yeah, so we are exactly in time. I just saw the red sign here. So just a brief summary, we're looking back, today's pre-flight world, and then the pre-press factory as we see it of the future.